Good morning. I'm Jeff Lyon, General Manager of FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative, and I'm pleased and want to thank you for joining our webinar this morning on the Farm Bill, Trade, and Immigration. Before we get into our discussion on the policy issues, I just wanted to provide a brief update on our FarmFirst membership benefits. This won't take long, but I just thought it was a great opportunity to remind all of you of what we're doing on your behalf. And then we'll take a look at the policy issues. As I said, we'll focus mainly on the Farm Bill, the trade and tariff issues, and immigration, things that we've been advocating on in Washington, D.C. We'll have plenty of time for question and answers. And if you can see on the screen, just submit your question by typing in the box on the right side of your screen in the webinar panel. And then when we get the questions and we get to that section, I'll just offer up the questions and we'll do the answers there. As I said, our presentation will not last longer than 30 minutes. Membership benefits with FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative. One is the top one on the disaster benefits program, test verification, tank calibration, youth sponsorships and scholarships, various educational opportunities, and then what we're really going to focus on today, the representation that we give our members out in Washington, D.C. on dairy legislative and regulatory issues. Just a little bit more detail on each of the member benefits. On the disaster benefits, I think some of you know, but just to remind you, that we pay for the loss of milk income, either through lightning or electrocution, that'd be the death of a cow, the loss of electric power, or due to impassable roads due to snow or flooding. This program, the disaster benefits, is unique to FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative. I don't know of any other that offers that, and certainly a nice benefit of membership. You're paying for all the other services that we provide, and this is something that we can add, you know, in the event we have any of those kind of situations, which certainly we don't want to happen. I think some of you probably already know that this past April, mid-April, we had a big snowstorm, and we had 5 South Dakota dairies were affected by impassable roads during the snowstorm, and the disaster benefit program paid out $20,000. One thing on the disaster benefits program that you need to know too is that farms, the limit on that is $30,000 per year per farm. So just so you know that it's if something happened more than once, that kind of thing, we do pay up to $30,000 per farm. On test verification and tank calibration, always check and ensure you're paid properly by reviewing milk tests in accordance with federal milk market order rules. Our field rep, Betty Lund, is out there on a regular basis, about every 2 weeks, doing those test verifications and obviously taking time to meet with members on any issues you might want to talk about. On tank calibrations, we ensure producers are properly paid for the volume of milk they ship. All our field reps are qualified to do tank calibration. So if that's something that you're needing on your farm, we can certainly take care of that, and just letting Betty know, and we'll take care of that and work with you on that. With respect to education, sponsorships, and scholarships, we're real proud of the amount of dollars that we spend to our students, members, children that are going into agriculture or other careers. And this is the 6th year in 2018 that the cooperative has been giving, generously, I believe, giving scholarships. And we've given out 148 applicants receiving nearly $130,000. We had 16 applicants this past year. So we've been able to help people further their education, which I think goes a long way in finding our next leaders and next people are going to be farming and involved in the dairy business. We also sponsor students to the Jackrabbit Dairy Camp, Gopher Dairy Camp, and the Badger Dairy Camp, and also the Professional Dairy Producer of Wisconsin Youth Dairy. So people with the children that are interested in going to those camps, you know, get a hold of us at the proper time when we're doing the signups for those, and we may be able to sponsor you, your kids to go to those camps. We're also involved with the Professional Dairy Producers at their annual business conference. Some of you may be members there, but a strong sponsor of what they do within the Professional Dairy Producers of Wisconsin. You can see here on the screen that one thing that FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative partners with a lot of groups, and these are just 4 of the groups that we work with: the Midwest Dairy Coalition, which we've been a member of for a long, long time, the South Dakota Dairy Producers, Minnesota Milk Producers Association, and the PDPW. Obviously a Wisconsin group, but I know the PDPW has reached out to a lot of farms out in the upper Midwest that provide educational opportunities, and we see that as FarmFirst a benefit to partner with them and do sponsorship activities with them. We're going to get into the Midwest Dairy Coalition here a little bit more. You can see here, and like I said, we're moving in now to the what we do is representing our members in Washington, D.C. There's a picture of me at Capitol Hill this June. I'm talking with Katie Zank. She's an ag staffer with Representative Colin Peterson. He's from Minnesota. We made visits to about 10 congressional offices that day, and just talking about Farm Bill, trade, and immigration, obviously, at that June meeting. I was also out there in March making visits as well and talking about dairy policy and the positions of FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative. That leads me into the introduction of Steve Etka. Steve is our lobbyist, and he's the person who's going to go over all the legislative issues that we've been working on. But I just wanted to introduce him a little bit. Steve heads up the Midwest Dairy Coalition, which FarmFirst is a member of. He's a former ag staffer for U.S. Senator Herb Kohl. He's from Wisconsin. He served on the American Farmland with the American Farmland Trust. I got to know Steve with the National Commission on Dairy Policy. This was a commission that came out of the 1985 Farm Bill. I happened to be working out in Washington, D.C. For a congressman, and then I went to work on this commission. And Steve and I and a couple other staff people worked with 18 dairy farmers to come up with future dairy policy, and that's where my association came with Steve. So I've known Steve for a long, long time. He's been very active and very involved in lobbying on agricultural issues. And like I said, I've worked with him since that time. And I want to tell you that out there with him in June, both of us were doing those meetings. Just want to tell you that he's highly respected, very knowledgeable about the issues going on in the dairy business. He's carved out a great niche for himself to become one of the experts. And in a lot of the dairy policy, there's very few people that know those issues. So like I said, we've been associated over my career before me even coming to FarmFirst, working with Steve on dairy policy issues. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Steve Etka to go through the legislative issues.
Thanks, Jeff, and good morning, everyone. As Jeff mentioned, I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I have represented the Midwest Dairy Coalition since the late 1990s. And FarmFirst and its predecessor co-ops have been part of the coalition since the very beginning. It's been a very busy year in dairy policy this year, and the most recent time that Jeff was in town on behalf of FarmFirst in June, we visited with a lot of folks in the House and the Senate and talked primarily about the Farm Bill, about trade, about truth in labeling on milk products, and about immigration. So those are the issues I wanted to go through with you all today. So let's start with the Farm Bill. As many of you all know, Farm Bills are written to last for 5 years. The last Farm Bill was written in 2014. Or at least was passed in 2014, but often it takes 2 or even 3 years to get it through Congress. So this current Farm Bill expires at the end of September, which is actually coming up very fast. Fortunately, both the House and the Senate have passed their versions of the Farm Bill, but they still have a lot of work to do in conference committee to reconcile the 2 versions of the bill, come up with a final bill, and get that passed back through the House and the Senate and onto the president's desk for a signature. I think there's been widespread agreement in the dairy industry and in Congress that the margin protection program that was established in the 2014 Farm Bill as a new dairy safety net for producers has not worked well at all and has really not been a credible safety net. In fact, one of the cases that FarmFirst and Midwest Dairy Coalition has been making is that the program has been so broken that we needed to get some changes and improvements in the program in place immediately for 2018, even before the Farm Bill started. So we were really pleased to see that Congress heeded this advice at the beginning of this year, and as part of a big budget package, did make some initial steps to improve the margin protection programs, and those are some that have been in place for the 2018 sign up. But even with those changes, we have argued for another bite at that apple, and I think there's been broad agreement in Congress about the need to do that. So let me just talk about a few things that are in the House and Senate versions of the Farm Bill with regard to MPP program reform. In fact, because they've made so many changes, they are no longer calling it MPP in the Farm Bill. They're calling it the Dairy Risk Management Program to make it clear that this is a new approach. Just going through a few of the highlights, both the House and Senate versions of the Farm Bill increase the buy-up coverage level from the current cap of $8 to allow farmers to go up to the $9 level now. This is something that FarmFirst and Midwest Dairy Coalition have strongly advocated for in this Farm Bill process. And we've also advocated that they look for opportunities to reduce the premium levels. So both the House and Senate do reduce the premiums for the tier 1 production, which is everyone's first 5 million pounds of production. One of our other big arguments is that we want to increase the flexibility that for farmers who want to participate in this safety net program. So we've got some good things and some bad things at play in the Farm Bill with regard to that. One thing I should mention is that there's a House provision that we really do not like and are very much fighting against, which would require farmers to lock in their buy-up coverage levels and their percentage production coverage levels for all 5 years of the Farm Bill. And we have argued that that actually will discourage farmers from participating in this program and make it less flexible. The Senate does not have that provision. We're hopeful that we can get that removed from the final bill once it's done. One House provision that we do think is helpful in this regard is a provision that would get rid of the current prohibition against producers participating in both the MPP and the LGM dairy program at the same time. The House bill does that by allowing producers to participate in the new dairy risk management program and the LGM dairy program at the same time, but not with the same milk. So for instance, if you're a larger producer and you want to participate in the new dairy risk management program, you can do so up to, for instance, 5 million pounds of production, because then you can take advantage fully of those lower premiums and then put the rest of your milk in LGM dairy if you choose to do so. We're pushing for that provision to end up in the final package. One thing that I think shows how much Congress has recognized that, in fact, the work that they did in the last Farm Bill to create the MPP program was not adequate is the fact that the Senate included a provision in their version of this Farm Bill to essentially refund all of the premiums that producers paid into the MPP program from 2014 through 2017, minus any indemnity payment that went out. So that essentially is totaling $77 million in refunds that are going to go back to producers if the Senate version of the bill prevails, which we are pushing. One thing I will say is that one of the big reasons that the MPP program coming out of the 2014 Farm Bill did not work is because, contrary to what the dairy industry had recommended to Congress for that Farm Bill, Congress, because of budget constraints at the last minute, changed the feed cost calculations and diluted those calculations in a way that meant that there were very few payouts, even in years where economic times were bad for dairy farmers. So initially in this Farm Bill cycle, we had been advocating for them to fix that We still ran into some budget scoring issues that made that very difficult. So we kind of decided to skin the cat in a different way by reducing the premium levels and allowing for buy-ups up to $9. Ultimately, we would still like to see some progress on the feed cost calculations. The House bill includes some requirements for USDA to do more work in that area, but I think that's going to be a work in progress. I should mention also that we do have a detailed chart showing the differences between the House and Senate versions of the Farm Bill in comparison to the current 2018 MPP program. And that can be found on the FarmFirst website. There's a link there to that document if that's something of interest. In terms of timing on the Farm Bill, I mentioned the current Farm Bill expires at the end of September. In talking to the Agriculture Committee staff today, it sounds like they have at the staff level at least had some initial conversations about reconciling the differences between the House and Senate versions of the dairy provisions, but those conversations have not really started in earnest yet. The House is in recess this week, as is the Senate. The Senate comes back next week, but I think even when they're in recess, there's going to be some work done at the staff level. I will say that in general, the direction on the dairy provisions in the Farm Bill, there's not a whole lot of disagreement between the House and the Senate. I mentioned a couple areas where there's a couple differences. So for dairy, I think that's encouraging. However, I will say that there are some big differences between the House and Senate on a couple areas. One is the nutrition programs, and the House has some work requirements for the food stamp program recipients that has been very controversial and are not going to be something the Senate can go with. And the House makes some big overall conservation programs, which is also a big point of disagreement between the House and the Senate. Those are going to be the two macro issues that are going to make conference difficult. And obviously they need to resolve all of this if they're going to get a final bill. I did want to turn now to trade. As you all know, ag trade has been very much in the news a lot in this last year. Most recently because of the March announcement by the Trump administration that they were going to impose tariffs on imports of aluminum and steel products from our trading partners. That announcement and the subsequent imposition of those tariffs resulted very quickly in a whole series of retaliatory tariffs from our trading partners, most notably for dairy from Mexico and China, who are our #1 and #3 largest markets for dairy exports. Those retaliatory tariff announcements on dairy products resulted in some immediate declines in both the spot and the futures market for dairy prices. Initial calculation was that the declines related to the response to the retaliatory tariffs would cost dairy farmers about $1.8 billion if those prices held. That's a kind of moving target because prices have recovered a little bit, but yesterday we saw a new round of retaliatory tariffs from China in kind of a spiraling fashion that included more dairy products and could lead to further declines in dairy market prices. So based on this, we have FarmFirst and Midwest Dairy Coalition wrote to the administration and strongly urged them to take some remediation action to make dairy farmers whole for this trade war and its impact on dairy prices. A couple weeks ago, we were pleased to see that the administration did do that and took many of our recommendations. We were, in our letter to the administration, recommending that there be some direct payments to dairy farmers to reimburse them for the harms they're suffering, and that there be some commodity purchases to help stabilize those markets. The president's announced plan, and we should be seeing more details about that later around Labor Day, did call for most of it, the 12 billion going for direct payments to farmers, called for a little export development assistance and some targeted commodity purchases. I will note that in our argument about commodity purchases, we made it clear that we want them to make those purchases in a way that doesn't cannibalize on existing commercial dairy sales and doesn't overhang the market in any way. In fact, we recommended specifically that products purchased be donated to food banks. I should also say that we don't think this is the right way to run a railroad. Given the importance of dairy exports for dairy farmers, for instance, in 2017, we saw the data showing that it's almost 15% of US production is exported. Given that significance, this makes us very concerned to be seeing this aggressive trade war ensuing right now, and we've made that case strongly to the administration. And unfortunately, since it has happened, we are asking for some remediation, but that's not, in our view, the best way to do business here. Even before the trade war started, there was a lot of discussion about dairy trade in the policy circles, because soon after the president took office, he announced plans to renegotiate NAFTA, and we saw this as potentially positive for dairy, but also potentially harmful in two ways. One, for Canada, we've always had a concern about trade barriers that Canada has in place against our dairy product exports. But more recently, with regard to Canada, they've established a new Class 7 pricing system for milk powder that has, in our view, resulted in some illegal subsidies of milk powder exports from Canada in a way that's cannibalized on many of our existing markets. So there's some upside there if the administration can make some progress with regard to Canada. The potential downside that we've been noting is that Mexico is our biggest dairy export market, and we didn't want to do anything through this NAFTA renegotiation that would jeopardize that market. Unfortunately, I think we've seen that some of those market opportunities in Mexico have been jeopardized. Particularly, this relates to the aggressive work by our trading competitor, the European Union, who has worked very aggressively to establish bilateral agreements with a bunch of countries in a way that has limited our access to those markets. And just a month ago or so, the EU and Mexico announced that they had reached a bilateral agreement that we fear will erode some of our market potential in Mexico. One issue in the bilateral agreement with Mexico, but other countries as well, is that the EU has been very strong in pushing its worldview that what we consider to be common or generic cheese names like Parmesan or Feta or Provolone, in their view, those are proprietary names that should only be allowed to be used by those countries where those names originated and those regions in those countries. And they have aggressively pushed that worldview as part of their bilateral agreements. And the result being that it limits our ability to export our cheese products to various countries using those names. So that's an ongoing fight that we're unfortunately losing at this point. A couple other things that we've worked on in the appropriation process and more broadly recently has been one, we've worked with Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin in pushing legislation in the Farm Bill in the Senate and the appropriations process to allow for grant making through regional initiatives to spur innovation in dairy businesses. This would help both cheesemakers and processors, and to a certain extent producers as well, in innovating and developing new products in a way that can help diversify dairy product production and help all farmers and processors deal with the kind of the ups and downs of the markets that we're seeing now. Another thing that we've been working on a lot, and is one of the things that Jeff was talking to our congressional delegations about back in June and before, is the issue of fake milk products. The Food and Drug Administration has regulations currently on the books that prohibit the use of the term milk and other dairy terms on non-dairy products, but they've done an abysmal job of enforcing those regulations. We therefore have been working on bipartisan legislation in the House and the Senate to put more teeth into those regulations and require FDA to enforce its own rules. We were pleased to see a couple weeks ago that FDA commissioner has started to kind of, Gottlieb is the name of the commissioner, he has started to wake up on this issue and been issuing some statements suggesting that he's going to pick up the pace and start enforcing the rules. In fact, he made a comment at a public meeting a couple weeks ago where he noted that almonds don't lactate when he was mentioning his intention of enforcing the standards. So we've been very pleased to see that, and this is going to be unfolding over the next year, we think. As you can imagine, the plant-based quote-unquote milk product advocates have not liked that trend and have not liked the comments coming out of the FDA recently. And as a result, they pushed for an amendment in the appropriations bill that was being debated on the Senate floor a couple weeks ago that would have blocked FDA's ability to enforce its milk standards issue. And this is one case where we've seen a threat turn into a benefit because we were able to defeat that amendment by a really strong vote of 14 to 84 in a way that I think will send a very strong message to FDA about congressional intent with regard to milk labeling. So let me talk a little bit about immigration real quickly. Immigration has been a really tough nut to crack because the political lines and divisions over how to address immigration have been so deep and so divisive. FarmFirst and Midwest Dairy Coalition have long made the argument on Capitol Hill and with the administration and the previous administration as well that foreign-born labor is critical to dairy farms and that some legislation must be passed to address the legal status of these workers given their importance to our farms. But that's, as I mentioned, immigration more broadly has been very, very controversial. As an example of how controversial it has become, the House Freedom Caucus, which is largely the Tea Party branch of the Republican Party in the House, which is the most conservative branch of the party, joined together when the Farm Bill was being debated on the House floor a couple months ago, and were able, because the vote margin was so close, to have a block of votes to oppose final passage of the Farm Bill. They weren't doing that based on the Farm Bill itself. They were doing that to show leverage on forcing the Speaker to bring up immigration legislation for a vote. Because they were able to do that and essentially killed the Farm Bill vote at that time, the Speaker did bring up two different immigration packages and they both failed. The Senate a year earlier went through a similar experience where they spent a week trying to debate immigration and could not get enough votes to pass any one version. So ultimately, after those two bills were brought up at the Freedom Caucus demand, the Farm Bill eventually did pass in June of this year. We have worked with Congressman Goodlatte, who's the chairman of the Senate House Judiciary Committee, which is the committee that has jurisdiction over immigration, to support legislation to create a new ag guest worker program. As you all know, the current guest worker program, the H-2A program, does not work for dairy because it's focused on seasonal labor. And as you all know better than anyone, dairy is not seasonal. So the Goodlatte bill would create a 3-year visa for all of ag. And we are very hopeful that very encouraging of the House leadership that they take action to bring this bill up for a vote right after the recess. I will say that the bill was recently revised and reintroduced to address some concerns that we had about some of the nitty-gritty details of the bill. And Congresswoman Noem, your Congress member in the House, did co-sponsor that bill, which we're very happy to see. We are told that the Speaker is currently counting votes on that bill right now during the recess to see if they have the 218 votes needed to pass. And we're hopeful and working to try to get them to that level so that they can take action on this issue in September. With that, I want to turn it back to Jeff and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. And Steve, if you might, just a little bit more on the trade side of things, if you could just go into detail, any insight that you have as to, when things might be, going to see a break on it? Is the Trump administration very firm on maintaining these tariffs, or is this just a negotiating tool? What's your view of that?
Well, I think the position that the president has taken in being aggressive about trade has been that, in his view, doing so is a negotiating tactic to bring our trading partners to the table to make concessions that they've never been willing to make in the past. As I mentioned, this approach makes us nervous for obvious reasons, because the retaliatory tariffs from our trading partners have been kind of an obvious next step, and we've seen some real declines in milk prices in an already bad year as a result of that. Obviously, I hope the president is correct that this will ultimately down the road lead to some good outcomes, but that remains to be seen. I will say then in the last couple of weeks there has been some buzz that some of the negotiations with Mexico have, with regard to the NAFTA renegotiation, have stepped up and have taken a higher profile. The hope is, I think, that if that happens, that the administration would remove the tariffs on aluminum and steel from Mexico, which would allow Mexico to start to unravel their retaliatory tariffs against ag products. Obviously, we all have our fingers crossed and are pushing that happens. So we're kind of watching that. But I will say, on the other side of things, the retaliatory tariffs back and forth between the U.S. and China are kind of in a downward spiral mode at this point. So we're not sure where the floor is on that.
Thank you, Steve. I would just remind people on that if you do have a question, if you just submit it and type it in, then we'll take care of it and get it announced out there so everyone can see and hear the question. Steve, I'd like to go back to the Farm Bill real quick. You talked about that the dairy title provisions, some differences, but that things might, that dairy is not the problem, but that the SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps. What do you think ultimately happens with that? As you said, the Senate doesn't have anything like that. The House, their version was a Farm Bill was very partisan, with Republicans supporting, Democrats not supporting, but the Senate was a bipartisan bill. What happens in the end, do you think, with that issue?
I think that's going to be the biggest challenge that they face in getting a final bill across the finish line. Because if you think about it, the House leadership is very dug in on using the Farm Bill as kind of a welfare reform type approach through the work requirements for food stamp recipients. The Democrats in the House are adamantly opposed to that, and the Senate as a whole is saying they're not going to go down that road because they know it's going to derail the Farm Bill. So if you think about what the conferees who are putting together the final bill will have to do, if they go too far in the House direction, they're not going to be able to get the bill passed through the Senate. If they go too far in the Senate direction by taking out too many of those work requirements, it's going to be hard for them to get it passed in the House. And President Trump has sort of weighed in, indicating his preference for the House approach. He didn't necessarily say he'd veto a bill that didn't have that, but he's left his powder dry on that front. So, you know, in theory, they would just kind of go down the middle and do some reform, but not as much as the House. But it still remains to be seen whether there's a sweet spot there that can pass muster with both the House and the Senate.
Thank you very much, Steve. Just looking at my screen right now, I don't have any questions that I see up there right now. I assume that means that we've answered all your questions at this point in time, and I don't want to take any longer than we need to. Everybody's busy. You've got the farms to run and those kinds of things. I want to thank you again for participating, listening in on the webinar. If you do have any questions, concerns, want to bring things up on where FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative should be on these issues and get your views across, certainly do not hesitate to give me a call, send me an email, any kind of thing like that, and I'll visit with you and talk with Steve, and we can figure things out and take your issues to Congress in Washington, D.C. As you can see, it's a benefit to me and all the members of FarmFirst that we have Steve as our lobbyist based in Washington, D.C. They're every day working on the issues for us, and you've been a great resource for us, and does a fine job for us. So again, Steve, thank you very much for joining us on this webinar, and we'll keep working on the issues on behalf of all the FarmFirst Dairy Cooperative members. Thanks for your participation.
Thank you.